And the whole earth was of one language, and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. So, do we dismiss this classic Bible story as quaint, Bronze Age mythology? Or is this cautionary tale immediately relevant to 21st century realities? As today's science unlock quantum technologies from which nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. So-called advances in contemporary science are little more than the rediscovery of occult sciences lost to humanity many centuries ago. The key to ultimate power, the ancient fundamentals of etheric energy manipulation, were fully described in a New York Times article published on April 21st, 1908, by the famed inventor from Croatia, Nikola Tesla. Every ponderable atom is differentiated from a tenuous fluid, filling all space merely by spinning motion, as a whirl of water in a calm lake. By being set in motion, this fluid, the ether, becomes gross matter. Its movement arrested, the primary substance reverts to its normal state, stillness. It appears then possible for a man through harnessed energy of the medium and suitable agencies for starting and stopping ether whirls to cause matter to form and disappear. At his command, almost without effort on his part, old worlds would vanish and new ones spring into being. He could alter the size of this planet, control its seasons, adjust its distance from the sun, guide it on its eternal journey along any path he might choose through the depths of the universe. He could make planets collide and produce his own suns and stars, his heat and light. He could originate life in all its infinite forms. To cause at will the birth and death of matter would be man's grandest deed, which would make him the master of physical creation, make him fulfill his ultimate destiny. 30 years later, practical manipulation of the birth and death of matter was fully engaged by the United States military with creation of the atomic bomb. The Tower of Babel resurrected. In 1939, Jewish émigré physicists Leo Szilard, Eugene Wigner, and Edward Teller agreed that the United States president must be warned that fission bomb technology was looming as a dangerous possibility in Nazi Germany. Faced with such a dire potential threat, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized under absolute secrecy nuclear weapons development under Operation Codename the Manhattan Project. As directed by United States Army General Leslie Groves, construction of a secret city in New Mexico was initiated, and over the duration of the Manhattan Project, Los Alamos became home to thousands of employees, including many Nobel Prize-winning scientists. But the only evidence of its existence was a post office box mailing address in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Meanwhile, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, what the public thought was a massive armaments storage depot was actually the atomic bomb's uranium enrichment facility. The nation's most brilliant physicists and engineers assembled for the Manhattan Project were given a deadline of 19 months to design and deliver America's first atomic bomb. At a staggering cost of $2 billion, the power of the atom was ultimately harnessed, and in July of 1945, that power was unleashed with the Trinity atomic bomb test in New Mexico. A group of American scientists led by Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer gathered in a remote area of New Mexico at the 33rd parallel known as Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of Death. There at 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, the military detonated America's first atomic bomb. One month later, in August of 1945, 2 additional atomic devices were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, bringing the Second World War to an end. The Manhattan Project had successfully met its objectives. But what the Manhattan Project physicists may have failed to consider was that the atomic bomb's burst of energy would also be mankind's calling card, announcing to the universe that a technological society had evolved on a small blue planet in the backwater of the stars. Detonation of the atomic bomb would have sent a light-speed electromagnetic pulse into deep space, indicating to any sophisticated intelligences observing that a primitive society on Earth was tinkering with more than just a military weapon, but the basic fundamental fabric of time, space, and gravity itself. In other words, our fission bomb announced to the universe that human science was beginning to master physics that would ultimately allow creation of not just nuclear weapons, but the means to deliver them anywhere in space. Physics to challenge the gods. Is it mere coincidence that most UFO activity in the late 20th century began just 2 years after America began testing nuclear weapons? So to once more recall the biblical account of the Tower of Babel, Jehovah considered creation of the tower, an advanced technology, to be an intolerable challenge to his authority. Thus he intervened by confusing the language of its human creators and then scattering them across the face of the earth. This begs the question, has humanity entered a modern Tower of Babel moment wherein non-terrestrial interests might once again consider our dangerous technological manipulation of quantum physics an intolerable threat to the galactic order? A scenario not unlike the dilemma of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
If other galactic civilizations perceive Earth humans as a threat, should they wait until humans have fully deployed their dangerous technologies into space, or would they intervene before such technologies could be unleashed upon the cosmos? And just 2 years after the Trinity bomb test in New Mexico, something strange fell out of the sky not far from where that first atomic bomb was detonated. On July 8, 1947, the United States Army filed a sensational report that a crashed flying saucer was recovered near Roswell, New Mexico. The following day, however, the Army recanted its astounding claim, stating that the debris recovered was nothing more exotic than a lost weather balloon. To this day, despite all the sensational urban legend conjecture about this event, the full truth of that mysterious crash in the New Mexico desert that summer remains a jealously guarded secret. The Roswell debris may have been a weather balloon, but in 1947, the general rash of unidentified flying objects and flying saucers reported across the country reached such an epidemic proportion that they could not be ignored. Air Force Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, Chief of Air Materiel Command at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio, stated in a secret memo dated September 13, 1947, "The phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. There are objects, probably approximating the shape of a disk, of such appreciable size as to appear to be as large as man-made aircraft. The reported operating characteristics, such as extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, and action, which must be considered evasive when sighted or contacted by friendly aircraft and radar, lend belief to the possibility that some of the objects are controlled either manually, automatically, or remotely." Had the military's atomic bomb testing precipitated a large-scale extraterrestrial reconnaissance surveillance of planet Earth? But just 2 months following the alleged Roswell saucer crash, President Harry S. Truman signed into law the National Security Act of 1947, which created the National Security Council and America's first peacetime civilian intelligence organization, the CIA, an intelligence agency mandated with no provision for congressional oversight. So assuming the Roswell crash was actual evidence of an unknown technology beyond our military's understanding or control, our defense agencies had no choice but to consider such evidence as a potential new threat on a far grander scale than even Nazi atomic bomb research. Pentagon officials now faced a threefold strategic problem: that highly advanced aircraft were being flown over our most sensitive defense installations by communist Soviet military, independent post-war Nazi elites, or extraterrestrials. This left the American defense establishment facing a tactical disadvantage of grander proportion than the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 years earlier. To cope with such a potential military threat required extending and expanding the Manhattan Project into a top priority research effort to investigate, emulate, and if possible, surpass the flight performance of such unidentified aircraft. And once again, as with the original Manhattan Project, this research had to be conducted in absolute secrecy, funded with vast amounts of monies entirely hidden from any congressional or public scrutiny. Consequently, this operation precipitated the discreet restructuring of the national security establishment, turning it into an autonomous, invisible political state unto itself. But harnessing power to challenge the gods was by no means limited to the United States Army's Manhattan Project. Germany's Third Reich had been fully involved in harnessing such powers itself. In fact, Reichsfuhrer Adolf Hitler was convinced he was God's instrument, destined to establish his own Aryan master race empire on Earth. In 1935, to satisfy his quest for absolute power, Hitler created the Anna Nerva Society, the only known state-funded historical structure to engage occult and mystical study to push beyond the limits of accepted technological understanding. The astrologer Wilhelm Wolff in 1939 described the ultimate goal of Nazi occult Ahnenerbe research was to harness not only natural, but also supernatural forces, all intellectual, natural, and supernatural sources of power, from modern technology to medieval black magic, and from the teachings of Pythagoras to the Faustian pentagram incantation, were to be exploited for the interest of final victory. And advanced weapons designed by the Third Reich over the course of the war demonstrated how far Nazi science had expanded. Supersonic jet aircraft, flying wings, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles were unmatched by Allied defenses. As well, the mysterious Die Glocke, or Nazi Bell Project, engaged over the last few months of the war, was clearly practical application of Nikola Tesla's torsion physics theories. But was the bell intended as an anti-gravity flying device, or a plasma wonder weapon infinitely more destructive than even a hydrogen bomb? Despite innovative Nazi weapons science, by May 1945, the German military surrendered in defeat. The war with Germany seemed, for the moment, to be finished. But over the ensuing months, a progression of disturbing incidents began to suggest that extraterritorial Nazi operations were still afoot. By April 1945, notorious SS General Hans Kammer, master of all top-secret SS projects that were missile or aircraft related, had vanished along with the Bell Project and all of its scientists. In January 1947, the United States Navy, Operation High Jump Task Force, under command of Admiral Richard E. Byrd, sailed with orders to seek out and destroy a Nazi stronghold in Antarctica. But after only 8 weeks, Byrd's group was allegedly repelled by a German contingent defended by fighters able to fly from one pole to another with incredible speed. Six months later, in June of 1947, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold claimed seeing a formation of 9 flying wings buzzing over Mount Rainier, Washington, aircraft distinctly similar to flying wings designed by the Nazi Horten brothers during the war, brothers who also escaped capture by relocating to Argentina. And of course, 1 month later, in July of 1947, we learned of the notorious UFO crash at Roswell, New Mexico. But even this mystery is laced with Nazi overtones. In his book, The Day After Roswell, Colonel Philip Corso, former advisor to President Eisenhower's National Security Council, revealed that conversations with Wernher von Braun and Willy Ley at Alamogordo in the days after the crash intimated that there was a deeper story about what the Germans had engineered. The similarity between the Horten flying wing and the craft they had pulled out of the Arroyo was no accident. And it was German physicist Dr. Hermann Oberth himself who cryptically revealed alien assistance with Nazi science. We cannot take the credit for our record advancement in certain scientific fields alone. We have been helped. When asked by whom, he replied, "The people of other worlds." Over the course of its occult research, had the Nazi Ahnenerbe Society actually made contact with extraterrestrials? If in fact the Roswell crash was evidence of an extraterritorial Nazi presence, it was politically untenable to reveal to the American public that after 5 years of the most devastating war in history, the old enemy was still alive, well, and freely roaming American airspace with virtual impunity. Even the remote possibility that the Roswell crash presented exotic Nazi technology made it an unquestioned threat to national security that had to be researched, matched, and surpassed with all due speed under absolute secrecy. At the war's end, American, British, and Soviet technical intelligence experts picked the bones of the Nazi war machine. Coveted war booty and personnel flowed back to each respective country. A massive post-war geopolitical realignment was underway. America's wartime ally, Soviet Russia, had turned adversary. Now both superpowers, the United States and the Soviets, were maneuvering into direct competition for global domination. Convinced that select German war personnel could ensure America's advantage in this bid for power, President Harry Truman agreed in September 1946 to authorize Project Paperclip, a program to use select German scientists and spies to assure America's lead in the Cold War rivalry. The United States had the bomb, and the Germans had the rockets. Combination of the two would make America the most formidable military power on the planet. As such, prized captive Nazi rocket designer Wernher von Braun and 300 railroad freight cars loaded with captured V-2 rocket components were shipped to White Sands, New Mexico for him to reassemble as America's rocket program. And Nazi spymaster Major General Reinhard Gehlen, whose vast intelligence network infiltrated both Eastern Europe and Russia, had become a prized asset for United States intelligence operations. Therefore, CIA Director Allen Dulles incorporated Gehlen and his entire spy organization unit into the CIA. Despite their sordid war reputations, for these post-war Nazis to fall into the hands of Russian communists, Truman declared, presented a far greater security threat to this country than any former Nazi affiliations which they may have had, or even any Nazi sympathies that they may still have. Even before the German surrender in 1945, the Nazi long-range comeback plan to regain power after the war revolved around using their friends and fascist sympathizers in other countries, particularly the United States, to do their bidding while rebuilding Germany. Despite the surrender of German military forces in Europe in 1945, the Third Reich still retained formidable global economic and political influence. And although the global media loudly proclaimed Hitler's suicide to pacify the world's war-weary population, intelligence insiders knew Adolf Hitler was alive and well, along with his deputy, Martin Bormann, tucked safely away in friendly Argentina. And by this time it was Martin Bormann who wielded the power of the Reich, and that power was wealth, vast amounts of plundered gold and other financial assets, enough to still wield significant, covert international influence. Over time, evidence of this invisible Nazi influence would begin to surface. On May 29, 1954, Western power leaders convened the inaugural meeting of the Bilderberg Group as a means of Western collective management of the world order. The corporate and banking elite of North America and Europe met at a small hotel in Oosterbeek, Holland. Attendees were such notables as President Eisenhower's CIA Director, Walter Beetle Smith, corporate executive David Rockefeller, as well as noted German banker Dr. Hermann Joseph Abs, whose bank years earlier had managed the accounts of Hitler's Reich Chancellery. In other words, Abs had once been the man signing Hitler's paychecks. As well, the Bilderberg meeting was chaired by former Nazi SS officer Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. Prince Bernhard had been former board member of Farben Bilder, a corporate subsidiary of the giant German chemical cartel IG Farben. Hence the name Bilderbergers denoted its membership as a super-secret fraternity of global policymakers, a nexus of international corporate, financial, and intelligence power brokers who would eventually absorb flying saucer and other top-secret post-war Nazi technologies into their private industrial interests, discreetly sequestering them from government scrutiny or control. The rise of German National Socialism had been no accident. It was financed by men of great wealth and influence who also shared Hitler's ambitions for absolute power. American corporate and financial empires that regarded Hitler as a useful instrument to expand their own sphere of wealth and control. Top-ranking United States corporations such as Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Standard Oil, and IBM. And clever Wall Street lawyers like Allen and John Foster Dulles had been instrumental in liberating such corporations from government restrictions against investing in business transactions that would benefit the Nazis. In the beginning, moving money into the Third Reich was quite legal. Lawyers saw to that, and Allen and his brother John Foster were not just any lawyers, they were international finance specialists for the powerful Wall Street firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. Prescott Bush, Yale's skull and bonesman and father of President George Bush Sr., was an investment banker for Brown Brothers Harriman Bank, which served as a United States base for the German steel industrialist Fritz Thyssen, who helped finance Hitler in the 1930s. After the war began, the United States government seized a string of assets controlled by Brown Brothers Harriman, including Bush's Union Banking Corporation, under the Trading with the Enemy Act. In fact, Prescott Bush had been identified as a co-conspirator in a plot to overthrow President Roosevelt and establish a fascist regime in Washington in 1934. Although the plot was foiled, Bush was never prosecuted. But after the war, these same corporate financial interests would eventually form a critical link with the National Security Council and government-held secret technologies, a control nexus over rocketry, space, and alternative energy research, all gathered to plunder the secrets of UFOs, the key to absolute power. An imperative need for a secret UFO research operation was outlined in 1947 by Air Force General Nathan Twining, who urged President Truman that the issue was bigger than the Manhattan Project and required that it be managed on a larger scale and obviously for a longer period. Twining further recommended formation of nothing less than a government within the government, sustaining itself from presidential administration to presidential administration regardless of whatever political party took power, and ruthlessly guarding their secrets while evaluating every new bit of information on flying saucers they received. The obvious dilemma in creating such a vast operation was how to secretly finance it. The covert Manhattan Project strained the defense budget at a cost of $2 billion. A hidden UFO research and development program on the scale of Twining's recommendation could last indefinitely, with costs far exceeding any reasonable defense budget. Where were such staggering amounts of money to be found? Just before the end of World War II in 1944, fearing his nation's ultimate defeat, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of Japanese forces in the Philippine Islands, stored tons of stolen gold bullion and other treasures scoured from across China and Indochina in hidden caves north of Manila. By October 1945, American Army intelligence officer Major Edward Lansdale learned of the Operation Golden Lily treasure, which he immediately relayed to General Douglas MacArthur, who in turn ordered Lansdale on to Washington, D.C. to brief President Truman firsthand. Truman then authorized recovery of the Japanese plunder to be held as a state secret, a vast wealth of treasure sequestered for an off-the-books covert operations funding reserve. In 1948, the newly created National Security Council institutionalized use of off-the-books funding for subversion against hostile states, with formation of the Office of Policy Coordination, OPC. Covert operations against suspected communist expansion around the world essentially became a permanent tool of statecraft, enlisting backdoor links to organized crime syndicates and drug trafficking, another lucrative source of covert monies. These operations would be conducted in such a manner so as to deflect any United States government responsibility with plausible deniability. Thus, the geopolitical game rules for the Cold War were set. Since all-out military conflict with Soviet nuclear power was an untenable option, a facade of restrained political propriety was overtly maintained between competing superpowers, while they sparred covertly in lesser conventional conflicts engaged sporadically around the world. But discreetly embedded within this funding for covert war games were monies designated for top priority UFO technology research as well. In the 1950s, as the Cold War deepened and superpowers' weapons competition became more deadly, the need for high-altitude spy planes and satellites to maintain surveillance over the Soviet Union became imperative. In 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower authorized CIA Director Allen Dulles to proceed with a crash program to develop a top-secret high-altitude spy plane to accomplish that mission. In turn, Dulles named Richard Bissell as director of the U-2 project. Built by Lockheed, the U-2 was tested and flown out of Area 51 in Nevada and discreetly financed by streamlined procurement, the CIA's unvouchered contingency funds. The U-2 was to serve as an intermediate surveillance effort until a permanent spy satellite network could be launched. In 1961, former Air Force Intelligence Director General Charles P. Cabell, serving as Deputy Director of the CIA under Allen Dulles, signed the Charter for the National Reconnaissance Office, a joint Air Force-CIA intelligence operation also covertly financed. This Dulles-Bissell-Cabell intelligence nexus of secret bankers was joined by none other than Nelson Rockefeller, who helped privately fund development of the CIA's Corona spy satellite, to introduce a satellite network intended for UFO surveillance as well. Essentially, these men were forming a dynamic interface alliance with national intelligence, military, corporate, and financial interests beyond constitutional scrutiny or legal authority. Of course, circumventing constitutional legal authority just happened to be the expertise of Allen Dulles, considering his corporate law background before the war. By 1961, President Eisenhower was so alarmed by the menacing illegal power festering within this military intelligence network that upon leaving office, he warned in his farewell television address against the looming danger of the military-industrial complex.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
And rightly so, these same Pentagon CIA cronies steered Eisenhower's successor, John F. Kennedy, into a failed Black Ops Cuban invasion fiasco that same year. Enraged, Kennedy struck back at the very heart of the CIA by firing its secret bankers, Allen Dulles, Richard Bissell, and General Charles Cabell. John F. Kennedy single-handedly sought to dismantle the secret off-the-books money empire that had been meticulously erected since the Roswell UFO crash in 1947, an intricately complex empire linked to Nazi scientists and spies, military defense contractors, corporate bankers, organized crime, and all financed with laundered drug money and Japanese war loot. Is it any wonder that Kennedy was gunned down in classic Black Ops fashion on the streets of Dallas in November 1963? Never again would an American president threaten the military-industrial complex. Control of space means control of the world. From space, the Masters of Infinity would have the power to control the Earth's weather, to cause drought and flood, to change the tides and raise the levels of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream and change temperate climates to frigid. There is something more important than the ultimate weapon, and that's the ultimate position. The position of total control over the Earth, that lies somewhere in outer space. Over the course of the Cold War, both American and Soviet nuclear weapons continued to be a source of interest for UFOs. Surveillance and even deliberate tampering by unidentified aircraft at nuclear missile installations were reported in both countries, and at times nearly provoking a nuclear war. Veteran Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell recently revealed knowledge of such reports from individuals who actually manned missile bases during the 1960s, when superpower Cold War tensions were at their peak. I have spoken to many Air Force officers who worked at these silos during the Cold War. They told me UFOs were frequently seen overhead and often disabled their missiles. Other officers from bases on the Pacific Coast told me their test missiles were frequently shot down by alien aircraft. There was a lot of activity in those days. The aliens wanted to know about our military capabilities. My own experience talking to people has made it clear the extraterrestrials had been attempting to keep us from going to war and help create peace on Earth. However, such UFO behavior as he described would be considered at least provocative, if not directly threatening, by our defense planners. So in 1983, President Ronald Reagan announced creation of a defense shield over continental America, the Strategic Defense Initiative, coined Star Wars by a skeptical press. And although Reagan publicly emphasized SDI was intended as protection from a Soviet missile attack, was his space-based weapons initiative actually the beginnings of an extended covert Cold War against UFOs?
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
Reagan clearly voiced his concern publicly about a potential extraterrestrial threat on multiple occasions. At the United Nations, he said,
"In our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?"
But was Reagan's SDI announcement simply mass media PR for a space-based weapons system that had already been operational for decades? According to the noted disclosure testimony of Dr. Carol Rosin, former assistant to the late Dr. Wernher von Braun, she stated that von Braun was fully aware of a vast space-based weapons system proposed by our defense planners. He revealed that there would be a multifold rationale to justify weaponization of space, the first identified enemy being the Russian communists. That would be followed by terrorists and third world country crazies. Then asteroids would follow as a planetary threat to further justify space weapons. And their ultimate trump card excuse would be invading aliens or extraterrestrials. That would be the final scare. And remember, Carol, von Braun insisted, the last card is the alien card. We are going to have to build space-based weapons against aliens. And all of it is a lie. Von Braun further emphasized that a covert space weapons system would be fully deployed long before the public ever realized it existed. But existence of an entire space-based weapons fleet advanced far beyond SDI was later verified by British whistleblower Gary McKinnon. In 2001, this British citizen and computer science genius, who claimed to have hacked into 53 United States government agency computer systems, said he was eventually able to hack into the United States Space Command network, where he found evidence of an extraterrestrial mission. I found a list of officers' names, he claims, under the heading Non-Terrestrial Officers. What I think it means is not Earth-based. I found a list of fleet-to-fleet transfers and a list of ship names. I looked them up. They weren't United States Navy ships. What I saw made me believe that they have some kind of spaceship off-planet.
And the other thing was a list of ship-to-ship and fleet-to-fleet transfers. Bear in mind fleet-to-fleet, so multiple ships, of materials. I surmised that an off-planet sort of space marines is being formed. And a lot of the government, space command stuff, it's all about space dominance, and it is, the final frontier. So I think it's natural for them to want to control space and be developing a space going forward secretly.
Inventor Nikola Tesla was nearly written out of modern history, not because he was a crank, but because his visionary genius was decades ahead of its time, unlocking doors to super technology that has been jealously sequestered by the national security state. As early as 1885, Tesla had already sold his patents for earthquake technology to United States weapons manufacturer George Westinghouse. Much later, during the Cold War, studies at the RAND Corporation advanced modern military war theory well beyond mere thermonuclear exchange by practical application of Tesla's geomagnetics theories. The United States military now controls and uses this technology at their high-frequency active auroral research project called HAARP, formerly located at Gacona, Alaska, but now advanced to mobile platforms that can be deployed anywhere in the world. In his book, Angels Don't Play This HAARP, Dr. Nick Begich confirms this tectonic weaponry is potentially more lethal than any of America's most powerful nuclear weapons. In 1966, during the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, Professor Gordon J. F. McDonald, Associate Director of the Institute of Geophysics and Planetary Physics at UCLA, was also a member of President Johnson's Science Advisory Committee and later a member of the United States President's Council on Environmental Quality. Professor McDonald developed ideas for using the environment as a weapons system, and from the chapter, How to Wreck the Environment, from his book, Unless Peace Comes, he describes use of weather manipulation, climate modification, polar ice cap melting, ozone depletion techniques, earthquake engineering, ocean wave control, and brain wave manipulation using the planet's energy fields. In other words, turning the planet itself into a weapon of mass destruction. In 1970s, Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the founding directors of the Trilateral Commission, who later served as National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter, stated in his book entitled Between Two Ages, "Technology will make available to the leaders of major nations techniques for conducting secret warfare, of which only a bare minimum of the security forces need to be appraised. Technology of weather modification could be employed to produce prolonged periods of drought or storm. As well, one could develop a system that would seriously impair the brain performance of very large populations in selected regions over an extended period." No matter how deeply disturbing the thought of using the environment to manipulate behavior for national advantages, to some, the technology permitting such use will very probably develop within the next few decades. As early as 1970, Zbigniew Brzezinski predicted a more controlled and directed society would gradually appear linked to technology. This society would be dominated by an elite group possessing superior scientific know-how. Unhindered by the restraints of traditional liberal values, this elite would not hesitate to achieve its political ends by using the latest modern techniques for influencing public behavior and keeping society under close surveillance and control. Perhaps another imperative to sequester Tesla's technologies were his secrets to anti-gravity and free energy. Tesla's reference to manipulation of ether whirls in his 1908 New York Times article was a prophetic description of torsion physics, the key to anti-gravity propulsion, a technology that very likely also found practical application in Nazi Germany during the war, particularly with the Die Glocke or Bell project, which used counter-rotating mercury plasma to generate levitation effects. Alleged Nazi saucers and even modern triangle UFOs, rather than the product of exotic alien science, very likely demonstrate practical application of Tesla's propulsion physics, but a highly valued physics to make our Black Ops defense aircraft a fair match to any intruding extraterrestrials. From the Bronze Age to the Atomic Age, from King Nimrod to Adolf Hitler, the quest for absolute power has been the identifying hallmark of human endeavor over the entire history of our race. This driving impulse, embedded deep within the human psyche, has manifested age after age, generation after generation, over millennia. This presentation has been but a cursory glimpse of the intricate web of interlaced historical events which over the last 100 years have propelled our species to the very brink of actualizing this quest. And within the lifetime of our contemporary civilization, the technology to achieve mastery of absolute power is now within human grasp. What began in 1947 as a defense initiative to protect our nation from a possible extraterrestrial threat, over time has morphed into an independent, top-secret infrastructure, a breakaway political, corporate, military, and financial civilization seeking absolute power for itself. Since President Kennedy's assassination, this secret state has been free to pursue its own agendas for achieving full-spectrum dominance, a bid for omniscient and omnipotent control over the entire planet and its population, agendas conveniently protected behind the shield of national security. And this entire off-the-books operation has been co-opted by succeeding dynasties of the world's wealthiest corporate and banking elite, who represent the very same interests that financed Adolf Hitler and the rise of the Third Reich. An elite who continue to share Adolf Hitler's totalitarian ambitions. As of today, virtually every aspect of human activity is fully under their control. Economics, politics, energy, food production, pharmaceuticals, mass media, education, defense, and law enforcement. even the planet itself has been engineered into a weapon of mass destruction. As such, has more than half a century of clandestine quantum technology research ultimately brought these elite to military parity with the gods, to where this national security state can challenge any attempted extraterrestrial Tower of Babel intervention on their own terms. Only time will tell.